Hey, my name is Fran Longstaff and welcome to Track Talks, More Than Equals webinar series. Today we're going to be exploring the gender gap in motorsports and we're joined by our driver coach, Sarah Moore, who I'll pass over to introduce shortly. But what I'll do first is introduce you to More Than Equal. So More Than Equal was founded a couple of years ago, and it's our mission to find the world's first female Formula One champion within the next 10 years. Today's session will be providing an overview of some research that we commissioned last year that really shines a light on the gender gap in motorsports and the experience of females within motorsports. But I'm going to pass you over to Sarah Moore now, who is one of our driver coaches, to provide a bit of an overview of her background and herself.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Moore, one of the coaches for More Than Equal. I guess the background about myself, I was born into the motorsport world, so my dad used to race himself, and I actually started my own journey, probably I think I was around 4 years old, in my famous Barbie cart, as we called it. My dad specially made it for me because I was that small that there wasn't one that would fit me. So that's where my journey started, and I did various championships and categories throughout my go-karting career, and then moved into cars when I was 14, into the Ginetta Junior Championship, became the first female to not only win a race at that level, but also to actually win the championship. So that was in 2009, and then I predominantly did endurance style racing, mainly in the Ginettas, so moved through their ranks, and then most recently raced in the W Series in single seaters, and had some very good results there as well. So that's kind of a bit about myself.
Well, I can't compete with that introduction. But I'm Fran. I've been in post as head of research for a couple of months now. And More Than Equal is a research and data-led organisation. So to support the identification, progression and performance of female drivers, we have to understand how to do all of that, and research is the foundation for that. But last year we commissioned our first piece of research to really understand what the barriers are to female drivers in motorsports, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So, why are we here? For many of you, you might have seen motorsports, you might have watched Formula One, and you probably haven't seen any women there, certainly not in recent history. In fact, a woman hasn't competed in Formula One since the early 90s. And even before that time, there was only a handful of women that ever have. So More Than Equal is here to support the identification, progression and performance of female drivers, knowing that it's not really been a path that's been trodden by a lot of women to date. I guess for us as an organisation, we've been really struck by the fact that over the past decade, the past 20 years, women have been breaking the glass ceiling across multiple sectors, sports, industries, and it hasn't happened in Formula One yet. So that's what our purpose is, our goal, our ambition. And it's not just about identifying a female driver who performs on that global stage. It's about the wider societal impact that our work has. Formula One is one of the biggest global sports in the world. And through understanding how to support women in sport in a really challenging and complex environment, we can then apply those findings to other sectors and environments. And that's a big aim of More Than Equals. So what are we really dealing with when it comes to women in motorsports? Well, to help us understand this, we did the largest piece of research that has ever been done on females in motorsports before, as part of our Inside Track report. So as part of this piece of research, we did 3 phases of data collection. The first was to do a global survey with motorsports fans across multiple countries across the world to really understand fans' perceptions of women in motorsports. We also did in-depth interviews with 70 relevant stakeholders across motorsports, ranging from drivers and their parents right through to team managers, sponsors, etc. And finally, we did a big piece of desk research to really understand the research that's already out there on women in motorsports, and also how women are portrayed by the media. So to help us really understand what the current landscape is for women in Formula One, we first surveyed over 13,000 fans in motorsports. And what we found was that nearly 80% of fans believe that a woman will compete in Formula One in the next 10 years. But that percentage goes down drastically when we ask them, will we actually see a female Formula One champion? So to help us understand why fans hold these beliefs, we looked at the participation and performance of female drivers in motorsports. What we found is that actually there's a very small representation of women in the participation base in motorsports. So using driver database as our source of truth, we identified that participation in females typically ranges between 7 and 13% of the whole motorsports participation base. So at this point, Sarah, what was your experience as a young driver going into motorsports, especially with these low numbers in mind?
I think seeing the numbers, you know, for real actually brings it a bit more to life. I think when I first started out myself, it's not something that I actually thought about. My family have always been very, very supportive. So having a supportive family and also friends around me, I think maybe not think about it, to be honest. But if I look back now, I think I was one of maybe a handful of female drivers within the go-karting paddock when I first ever started off. So yeah, when I look back, it's almost kind of a little bit scary actually, you know, if I thought of that and how I was feeling at the time and actually realised I was one of few, I think I would have looked at things a little bit differently.
Yeah, but for you at the time, it was just normal.
That's the way that it was. Exactly that, yeah. For me, throughout my whole motorsport career, to be honest, until I got, I guess, you know, to the highest level that I have been to, I never really thought about it.
What we have identified, though, is that there's been significant growth in the female participation base, especially over the last 5 years. So 23% of participation growth since 2000 has actually happened within the last 5 years. So we can see some significant movement. Sarah, have you seen any difference over the last 5 years in terms of the number of girls that are entering the sport?
I think definitely, and I think social media has actually helped to bring that to life in the fact that the females within the sport are becoming more visible, and I think also, you know, with help of certain championships, like the W Series, like F1 Academy, social media has definitely helped to highlight the females within the sport, and I can see myself that the younger generation, they're starting to bring more girls into the sport, which is good to see.
Yeah, so it's a sort of cyclical thing, isn't it, whereby you have the role models and then you get that positive movement into the sport. And we'll definitely talk about that shortly when we get into the barriers that affect and impact women's participation in motorsports. What we also know from our data is that women typically, or young female drivers typically have a much, much shorter career when it comes to motorsports, with the average female driver having a motorsports career ranging from 1 to 5 years, whereas for boys and men, that's typically a 12-year career. So we know that girls aren't staying in motorsports long enough to necessarily break that performance ceiling. And that's why on the previous slide, you would have seen that 40% of the participation base in females is typically in karting, because that's likely where they drop out of the sport there as well. So when we talk about the participation base with female drivers, we know that that's really small. But that has an impact then on the performance levels that can be achieved by female drivers. So what we know from our research is that only 4% of drivers with talent rankings are actually made up of females. So that's a really, really small number of females making up the top performers in motorsports. We also know that females generally tend not to be in the upper echelons of performance and far more likely to appear in the middle and bottom end of performance. And really, a lot of that boils down to essentially not having a big enough base at the bottom of that progression pyramid. We were talking about this earlier, weren't we?
Yeah, I think, you know, in terms of females and progression within motorsport, unfortunately, most of it does stem back to finances. But also the support that they receive along the way, not just on the financial side, but the fitness, nutrition, psychology, it all has a huge effect on how the driver is able to perform as a whole, which in turn has an effect on how they or if they progress, I guess, to the next level.
Yeah, absolutely. This is where we kind of really get into the nuts and bolts of understanding female drivers' experiences. So what we know from our data is that participation and performance levels are currently low in the female driver base. But where we really advance knowledge and understanding and begin to develop systems that really support female drivers is by understanding the why. So why is this happening? What are the barriers facing female drivers? Even when we surveyed motorsports fans, only 51% actually knew with any certainty that women can even race in Formula One. And that's in your fan base. That's in the people who are really passionate about the sport. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that if people don't even know that it's possible to become a Formula One champion as a woman, it raises the question, why would you even begin that journey, that path, if you don't know it's possible in the first place? You'd likely go down other avenues. It also then has an impact on role models. Because there's a lack of visibility, there's a lack of role models. And as we were talking about before, that really impacts that cycle, doesn't it? Who was your role model when you were starting out as a young driver?
I think for me, when I first started out, it was never really thought of as a career for me. So I didn't actually think of motorsport as a career until I actually made the transition from go-karting into cars, and actually won my first championship. At that point, I thought, okay, this is a career. But when I kind of look back even just at that point, for me, there was no visible female role model at the top end of motorsport that I can remember for me to look up to. So for me, it was, there was only men. So it was Jenson Button was a key role model for me, Mark Webber. Outside of motorsport, Jessica Ennis-Hill, I was a huge fan of her. So, but that's away from motorsport, and not everything there can be applied. So.
Yeah, there was something really interesting that you said there, which is, you didn't think of it as a career because you didn't have those role models to aspire to. Did the boys that you were competing against, do boys go into karting with a career in mindset?
100%. I mean, I would definitely say so. I think one example for me is I was competing in the championship in go-karting, and Lewis Hamilton was coming to do a talk. And obviously, even I was excited, that Lewis Hamilton was coming to do a talk, but literally the boys were fighting over the front seats, and I think as soon as they get into motorsport, because there is, well, all of the drivers in F1 at the moment are all male, so they have so many role models to look up to, and they just, I wouldn't say choose, but they have their favourite driver, and that's who they aspire to kind of be.
Yeah, it's interesting because you then go into karting with a completely different mindset. Is this a potential career, or is it a hobby? And that really can affect your trajectory right from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, they then, want, if they've been watching Formula One, they have a role model within Formula One, they would then kind of look back at the history of how that driver got to Formula One, and that would, I guess, almost kind of become their pathway or their ideal pathway to Formula One.
Yeah, they can see it, so
exactly.
There's a believability there. So to really understand the environment, so we know that there are a lack of role models, and that can really impact participation levels and then obviously progression from that. We know that there are a range of environmental and cultural barriers at play, and certainly on this slide I've listed only 5, but I can tell you, having been in that data from interviews with 70 relevant stakeholders, there are so many barriers to female participation. The quote here really summarises it, especially when I was younger, the environment wasn't one as a girl that I was particularly comfortable in. And when I was analysing the interview data, I saw this come up time and time again. And one female driver said that there were occasions where she would be laughing along with jokes that, at their core were sexist, but she did that to feel part of the environment. So what we understand from the environment is it's not necessarily inclusive for women, it's male dominated, and it's driven by that. What we also understood from our research as well, that there were actually a lack of facilities for female drivers. So some of the drivers and the parents of drivers that we interviewed, the female drivers, talked about the fact that karting facilities, there weren't changing rooms or toilets for female drivers. Was that something that you experienced?
Personally, no, because I ran inside a family team and we had our own, our own setup, and we lived in a motorhome at the circuit. So I basically got changed there, woke up, got changed, get ready and went. But that aside, I can say, there was a lot of places when I was younger that didn't have female toilets.
Yeah.
Or even changing rooms in general, not just, male, female, but they just didn't have changing rooms. So there's been many a times throughout my career where I have actually had to get changed in the toilets because there were no changing rooms. Or in the disabled toilet even.
And I guess implicitly that gives a signal that this isn't an environment for a woman to participate in, to perform in. Something that also came up consistently was that there was a lack of female-specific coaching support and training provision for female drivers. Sarah, what's your experience of this?
I think one big thing for me in terms of training, and one thing that I found a lot with my own training, mainly towards kind of the higher end of my racing, was when it comes to your physical training, is working around your hormones. That was one of the most difficult things for me to try and work my training around it, but also to find a coach that you can feel comfortable having that conversation with. And for me, it was finding a female coach, because for me, I felt a lot more comfortable speaking about hormones with another female as opposed to a male. And that made a big change for me in terms of my training, which then had a knock-on effect in my ability on the track. So
yeah, and I guess actually it's only over recent years, isn't it, that a lot of sports have even started to have those conversations about the impact of the menstrual cycle on performance and training. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interestingly, when I was reading the interview extracts, one of the participants, when they were talking about the training and coaching provision, said that we can't think of women just as small men. And that's really interesting, because I think a lot of training programs are actually built with that mindset, whereas the female body works completely different to the male body. It's not that women can't achieve really high levels of performance, but you have to work with the body in order for that to happen. Yeah,
and I think there is not enough research. I know there is research out there that has been done into the differences between the development of a male versus a female body. But in terms of the finding the S&C coaches, that actually know enough knowledge in the differences, they're very, very hard to find. I say when you do find one, stick with them. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's clear that it's few and far between in that sense. Something else that came up from our research was the fact that a lot of female drivers and their parents said that typically they would get a lot less track time than the male drivers. And track time is obviously where the skill development happens. Mm-hmm. What was your experience of this?
I think for me personally, I would say a lot of it still comes back to finance. But finance in the fact that in terms of people wanting to sponsor or support drivers or athletes, it comes back to that thing of, if the female is saying they're wanting to get to Formula One, that sponsor says, oh, well, there's no female in Formula One right now, so why would I want to support you? So they get less financial backing, but the financial backing that they are getting, they're putting towards race weekends and no additional testing, whereas the males can, I'm not saying everyone can, but they tend to get more sponsorship and more support, which allows them the extra finances to be able to do that extra bit of testing. And I think that's where the difference comes in.
Yeah, so they really start to pull away at that point. Yeah, and as you can see on the bottom slide here, the critical barrier to female drivers, regardless of who the stakeholder was that we interviewed, came down to sponsorship and finance. And what a lot of female drivers said ultimately is that they couldn't get the sponsorship to progress. So they get to a ceiling point where you've kind of gone as far as you can from your own wallet, and then if you can't get that money, then you just can't progress at that point. And I guess a lot of female drivers talked about the fact that even if they went to a sponsor and they were performing well, sponsors might not necessarily even believe that there's still that potential there. So lots of barriers, environmental, cultural, working against females. And you can really see why they're not necessarily staying in the sport as long as we would hope them to, and progressing through the sport as well. Yeah, nice quote here just to demonstrate the significance of sponsorship as a barrier. Ultimately, it's just getting more expensive to find the sponsors to support you to go racing and give you a real chance to compete with a really good team. And that's where the difficulty and challenge is. We probably couldn't do this piece of research without touching on stereotypes. So stereotypes in and of themselves are never a direct barrier, but indirectly they influence the behaviours and decisions that relevant stakeholders make. So whether that's a sponsor, whether that's a team manager, to invest in a driver. Stereotypes, negative attitudes can sit at the heart of those decisions that are made. And there were two that consistently came out for us. So the first was that women aren't technically capable of competing in Formula One. And there was a lot of talk around, do women have the risk-taking propensity and aggression to technically cope with the demands of the sport? What would you say to this?
I mean, I think any female in any sport has to, be able to technically, deal with many things. So I think, in my opinion, that's totally irrelevant, because it's all down to how much work we're willing to put in and how much we really want to reach that goal.
Another stereotype that a lot of female drivers and the stakeholders talked about was the physical capabilities and whether they had the required neck strength to be competitive in Formula One. To date, there hasn't been any research that has directly compared male and female drivers' neck strength. So that research hasn't yet been conducted. But what we do know is that female fighter pilots regularly fly under G-forces far greater than those applied in Formula One. We also know that females from many other sports are able to hit physical capabilities and performance levels that well exceed some of the data collected in motorsports. So that possibility is absolutely there. The research just hasn't yet been done. And at More Than Equal, that's what we're committed to doing, to better understanding what the gender differences are and what the different predictors of performance are, so that we can better inform that training. But stereotypes it's really important to do that research to challenge those stereotypes, because those stereotypes are indirectly working against female drivers because that data just isn't there yet. So it's a big challenge. There's a lot to do in terms of increasing the numbers of women in motorsports and increasing the number that are performing. And we know that we're working against a lot of barriers, and we've got to break those barriers down. But ultimately, we're in a good place because we know what they are. And that's always the first part of the battle, really, the first part of the challenge. So what are we doing at More Than Equal to break these barriers down and better support the identification, progression and performance of female drivers? So at More Than Equal, we adopt a four-pillared approach to supporting female drivers. The first is that we're a research and data-led organisation. So we do research to really truly understand the challenge in front of us so that we can put in place solutions that are most appropriate. I think often a lot of strategies fall down because they're not necessarily addressing the correct areas, because the base level of research hasn't been done to do that, to inform that knowledge and that strategy. So research and data is a key pillar for us. We've also re-engineered the way that we identify female talent. So we work with our partners at Smedley to identify female talent across the globe, knowing that it might be in an area where we didn't even think of looking before. That's what we do. We're data-driven in that talent identification. We also are running the world's first female and age-appropriate driver development program, which Sarah is heavily involved in doing. And we're evaluating that program as we continue so that we can iterate it and develop it as the drivers develop with us. And then finally, we're working hard to connect the talent with the correct opportunities, knowing that things like sponsorship, finance, even getting the right conversation with the right teams can be really challenging. And I think regardless of whether you're in motorsports or not, you might be a woman who's working in an equally challenging male-dominated environment. You might be struggling to progress. This strategy could easily apply to different environments, different sectors and industries, understanding the problem, working out ways to identify talent to bring people into the organisation, developing that talent in an appropriate way and connecting that talent so it can progress. So thank you for giving some of your time to us today so that we can share some of those findings and research and hopefully taking away that the work that we've done within motorsports is absolutely applicable to the society more generally. So Sarah, you've obviously shared your experiences today. Are there any kind of closing recommendations or bits of advice that you would share for females who are perhaps wanting to progress through motorsports?
I would say stay focused on yourself, surround yourself even with the right people, but also don't be scared to reach out to other females within the sport, because as a whole, the other female drivers within the sport, we all want the same thing, and that is to bring more females and girls into the sport as a whole, but also to see more females at the top levels of motorsport.
If you want any more information, then please do feel free to access our website at morethanequal.com, and there you can also download the full Inside Track report so you can really get to grips with the data and research that we've done. Thanks Sarah so much for your insights. I think research is only as good as its application, and we need people to bring those findings to life, so it's always really nice to hear the human side of it, and thanks from me as well.